You set the hook and felt the weight. For a second, everything was right. The rod loaded, the line went tight, and that unmistakable pull traveled all the way up your arms. Then it was gone. Not gradually, not after a long fight. Gone between one breath and the next, like the fish had never been there. Here's what most bank anglers get wrong about that moment. They blame the hook, the knot, or bad luck, when the real explanation is mechanical, repeatable, and completely fixable once you understand what actually happens between the strike and the net. 3 things this video covers: what the base is physically doing with its mouth before your hook point ever penetrates, why the moment you feel the fish is often too late to set the hook correctly, and exactly how rod position during the fight determines whether a bass stays on or shakes free in the air. None of it requires anything new in your tackle box. Imagine you're standing on the bank along a stretch of timber. Fallen log running parallel to shore, maybe 8 feet out, partially submerged on a slight angle toward the bottom. You've cast past it, let the bait sink, dragged your soft plastic back through the shadow on a slow pull, and felt that tap. That's your laboratory for the next few minutes. 1 log, 1 bite, 1 fish that's either in your hand at the end or 20 yards away, wondering what just happened. When a largemouth bass decides to eat a soft plastic resting on the bottom, it doesn't bite in the way most beginners picture it. Research published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2015 from Brown University showed that largemouth bass are suction feeders. They open the mouth cavity rapidly and double its internal volume in milliseconds, creating a pressure differential that literally vacuums the prey inward. The same swimming muscles that power their burst speed also power this feeding motion. That matters to you as an angler because it explains exactly what you feel as a tap or a thump on the line. In most cases with soft plastics on the bottom, the bait moved toward the fish, not away from it. The fish closed its mouth around the bait, but that absolutely does not mean the hook point is buried in the jaw yet. Now here's the first mechanical error most bank anglers make without ever knowing it. When a bass takes a Texas-rigged soft plastic, the hook point is folded flush against the body of the bait. That's the entire purpose of the rig, so it passes through timber and grass without hanging up on the retrieve. The moment the base closes its mouth, that hook is still protected inside the plastic. The hook set, the sweeping motion you make with the rod, is supposed to first compress the plastic out of the way and then drive the point through the bait and into the jaw tissue. If you set the hook before you've removed all the slack in the line, that force dissipates in the slack and never reaches the fish at all. At bassresource.com, instructor Glenn May demonstrated this exact failure mode in detail. The bullet sinker contacts the roof of the bass's mouth before the hook point clears the bait. The angler feels resistance and thinks it's a solid hook set, fights the fish for several seconds, and then the bass opens its mouth and the lure slides out clean. Hook point never penetrated bone or tissue, not once during the entire encounter. That is not a hook design problem. That is a timing and rod angle problem. Here's what to fix. First item, your rod tip position. Before the hook set matters more than the speed or force of your swing. If your rod is already up at 10 or 11 o'clock when you feel the bite, you've already consumed most of your sweep distance before the arc even starts. There's nowhere left to travel that adds meaningful force to the hook point. Start with the tip low, pointed at the water or angled toward where the fish is sitting. When you detect the bite, reel down toward the fish first to pull out the remaining slack in the line. Then make your sweep low and hard. The rod travels through a full arc of useful, tension-building pressure rather than burning the first half of it recovering from a neutral or elevated starting position. The Missouri Department of Conservation's official angler guidance states it plainly. Setting the hook with slack line or a loop in the line usually won't cause the hook to penetrate and will likely cause the fish to drop the bait before you feel any real resistance. Your drag and the flex of the rod blank absorb the shock of the strike, but only if there's actual tension on the line at the moment the sweep begins. Second item. The position of the hook in the fish's mouth tells you how the rest of the fight is going to go, starting from the first second. When a base is hooked deep in the interior of the lower jaw, near the back of the lip close to the hinge, the hook has almost no leverage to work free because the tissue there is thicker and the angle of pull keeps it seated. When the hook is on the outside of the lip or in the thin frontal tissue at the very tip of the jaw, the fish has far more mechanical advantage for head shakes to lever the point out against the softest part of the tissue. Research cited by Wired 2 Fish in 2023 noted that bass hooked on the outside of the mouth often swiped at the bait reactively rather than committing to it, meaning outside mouth hookups are frequently a sign of neutral fish behavior, not a hook selection problem. You usually can't see where the hook landed, but you can feel it. A bass that's poorly hooked fights with short, rapid head shakes from the moment you pressure it. Frantic, irregular, pulling in small bursts. A well-hooked bass fights with longer, sustained runs and direction changes. That difference in feel is your signal to adjust how aggressive you are during the fight, not to simply hold on and hope the hook stays put. Third item. Rod angle during the fight is where the majority of bank anglers lose fish that were already well hooked and would have been landed. The natural instinct is to hold the rod high, tip toward the sky, arm extended, rod nearly vertical. This creates a specific mechanical problem. When a bass runs toward you and you drop the rod tip to pick up the slack, there's a window of slack line in the system. That window is when the hook falls loose because there's nothing maintaining pressure on the point. Yamaha Outboard's fishing editorial explained this failure in detail. Once the rod is lifted past roughly 2/3 of the arc between horizontal and vertical, you gain no additional pull on the fish. You're only storing elastic energy in the rod blank. And when the fish turns or surges suddenly, that stored energy releases as slack rather than maintained pressure. Hold the rod at roughly 45 degrees and use lateral side pressure, moving the rod tip to the left or right rather than lifting it higher, to change the direction of force the fish must work against. Constant direction changes deplete a bass's energy reserves faster and more reliably than a steady upward pull. Nebraska Game and Parks reinforces this in their official fish fighting guidance. Change the direction of pressure throughout the fight, forcing the fish to counter your moves rather than leaning into a single angle it can brace against. Fourth item, the jump, and what to do the moment before it happens. A base that clears the water has reached its most effective escape window. Air is roughly 775 times less dense than water, which means head shakes that would have been partially absorbed by water resistance become far more violent and effective in the open air. The mechanical consequence is that every moment a base is airborne is a window for the hook to work loose through forces that the water itself would have dampened. The fix is the opposite of what most beginners do. When you see or feel the bass moving toward the surface before a jump, the line angle tightening and rising, lower the rod tip toward the water, not toward the sky. The lower pull angle creates downward pressure on the fish before it breaks the surface, making it fight the direction of the water rather than using your high rod as a launching assist. An avid tournament angler quoted in the Carolina Sportsman described it as the most common mistake he sees on the bank. Holding the rod high during a jump actually assists the base getting airborne, because the angled upward tension in the line becomes the very lift the fish is riding. Low rod means the fish is working against the water, which is where all the resistance lives. Fifth item, the final approach, inside the last 10 feet. This is where more fish are lost than most bank anglers would believe, because it's the moment when everything feels finished. A base that can see you, your shadow crossing the water, your shape on the bank, will make its hardest single run at that distance, not from strength, but from a triggered flight response. If your drag hasn't been adjusted as the fish tired during the fight, that final surge hits against a fully set drag and a rod that's already loaded. And that combination is where hooks straighten, knots fail, or the line parts at the leader. As you bring the fish into the last 5 to 10 feet, ease the drag back by a fraction and maintain steady side pressure with the rod at 45 degrees rather than lifting. The fish will turn onto its side and come in on its flank rather than on its tail, where it still has the leverage to make that last-second surge work. Now here's what changes everything you just heard. Everything covered so far. The pre-hook set rod angle, the sweep mechanics, the fight angle, the jump response, the final approach, can sound like 5 separate techniques to memorize before your next trip. But in the field, they're all expressions of the same thing. Every time a base throws a hook or pulls free, it found a moment when the pressure on the line became either completely slack or completely rigid. The hook fails to penetrate when there's no tension before the sweep. The base throws the hook on a jump when tight upward tension acts as lift. The line parts on the final run when the drag has no room left to absorb the surge. The base isn't executing 5 different escape strategies. It's doing one thing, over and over, at every stage of the fight. It's waiting for the moment when the pressure on the line becomes something it can use to its advantage, either slack to open the gap or rigidity to pry the hook point sideways. Consistent, adaptive tension, not maximum pressure, not loose line, but pressure that flexes in real time with what the fish is doing, is the single variable that either keeps the hook seated from strike to net or loses the fish at any one of those moments. That reframes every error above. The hook set, the fight angle, the jump response, and the final approach are not separate skills. They are the same decision made at different stages. How much pressure does this fish need right now? And is my rod position actually giving me the ability to deliver it? When that question has an honest answer at every point in the fight, the fish doesn't get the moment it's waiting for. If this changed how you think about what happens after the bite, there are more videos here that work the same way. No magic lures, no expensive gear, just practical ways to find and catch more fish. Subscribing makes sure you don't miss the next one. The fish doesn't lose the fight because it's stronger than you. It loses because you controlled the one thing it couldn't predict. The moment when the pressure on the line stopped being something it could use.